morning sun cast long shadows across the great courtyard of Kumasi, where Princess Amma stood before the golden stool that had seated her ancestors for 3 centuries. The weight of the royal kente cloth draped across her shoulders felt heavier than usual, as if the very fabric sensed the darkness approaching from the north. Messengers had arrived at dawn with news that would shake the foundations of the Ashanti kingdom. The Sokoto Empire's iron legions were marching south, their war drums echoing across the savannah like thunder before a storm. Amma's fingers traced the intricate gold patterns woven into her ceremonial bracelet, each symbol representing one of the 7 great clans that had sworn fealty to her father's line. The Yoko, the Betrayal, the Agona, names that once inspired unity now whispered of division. Since her father's death 2 seasons past, the clan chiefs had grown restless, their loyalty wavering like smoke in the wind. General Kwaku, her most trusted advisor and childhood friend, stood silently beside the throne, his weathered face betraying none of the concern that surely churned within him. Yet something in his eyes had changed in recent moons, a distance that Amma chose to attribute to the burdens of command, rather than question the one person she believed would never betray her trust. The war council convened as the sun reached its zenith. 7 clan chiefs arranged around the circular table like spokes of a great wheel. Each wore the colors of their house: crimson for the Asona, deep blue for the Ekuona, forest green for the Asoko, creating a tapestry of pride and barely contained animosity. Chief Ose of the Yoko clan spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of age and countless battles. "The Sokoto bring weapons forged in fires we cannot match," he declared, gesturing toward the captured iron sword that lay gleaming on the polished wood. "Their cavalry numbers in the thousands, their firearms thunder like the voice of angry gods." Amma listened to the debate that followed, watching as fear crept into the voices of men who had never shown weakness before an enemy. The Betrayal chief argued for retreat to the forest strongholds, while the Agona representative demanded immediate mobilization of all available warriors. Through it all, General Kwaku remained silent, his dark eyes moving from speaker to speaker with calculating precision. When the princess finally rose to speak, the room fell silent, but she could feel the doubt radiating from some quarters like heat from a forge. The unity her grandfather had forged through wisdom and strength was fracturing, and the enemy had not yet crossed their borders. Time was running short, and desperate measures would soon be necessary. Under cover of darkness, Amma made her way through the palace's hidden passages, routes known only to the royal family and their most trusted servants. The stone walls seemed to pulse with the memories of her ancestors, their spirits watching as she approached the chamber that housed the kingdom's most sacred and dangerous artifacts. The crimson spear of Ashanti lay in its obsidian cradle, the weapon that legend claimed could turn the tide of any battle, but demanded a price that few were willing to pay. Its crimson shaft seemed to drink in the torchlight, and the iron point gleamed with an inner fire that had nothing to do with the flames dancing on the walls. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, recounting the tale of King Osei-Tutu, who had wielded the spear against the Denkaira and emerged victorious but forever changed. Each enemy slain by the cursed weapon fed upon the wielder's essence, granting supernatural strength and tactical brilliance while slowly consuming their humanity. Above, in the palace halls, she could hear the soft footsteps of servants preparing for another day of war councils and desperate planning. But down here in the ancient heart of Ashanti power, Princess Amma faced a choice that would echo through generations. The spear pulsed once, as if sensing her presence, and she knew that her path towards salvation, or damnation, had already begun. Dawn brought fresh reports from the northern scouts, each more dire than the last. The Sokoto Empire's advance force had crossed the Volta River, their iron-shod horses leaving deep gouges in the earth that would serve as roads for the main army to follow. Chief Yaw of the Asona clan burst into the throne room without ceremony, his messengers dust still coating his elaborate robes. "They burn everything," he gasped, falling to one knee before the golden stool. The village of Tekemen is ash, its people fled or dead. Their general shows no mercy to those who resist. The assembled court erupted in angry voices, some calling for immediate evacuation of the border settlements, while others demanded that every warrior be summoned to defend their homeland. General Kwaku stepped forward, his commanding presence silencing the chaos with a single raised hand. "My princess," he said, his voice carrying the weight of military authority, "we must consider the possibility of negotiated surrender. The Sokoto are not unreasonable. They seek tribute and acknowledgement of their supremacy, not the destruction of our people." His words struck the assembly like a physical blow, and Amma felt something cold settle in her stomach as she watched the faces around her. Some showed relief at the suggestion, while others burned with righteous fury. But in Kwaku's eyes, she glimpsed something that made her blood run cold, the calculating look of a man who had already chosen his side in the coming conflict. The private meeting with General Kwaku took place in her father's old study, surrounded by maps that chronicled centuries of Ashanti expansion and triumph. Kwaku poured palm wine from a golden pitcher, his movements precise despite the tremor in his hands. Whether from age or some deeper anxiety, Amma could not tell. They had shared countless such evenings during her youth, planning hunts and festivals, discussing the responsibilities of leadership that would one day fall upon her shoulders. Now, as storm clouds gathered beyond the window, those innocent days seemed impossibly distant. "You speak of surrender as if it were merely another military tactic," Amma said, watching his reflection in the polished surface of her cup. "My ancestors would rise from their graves to curse such cowardice." Kwaku's face remained impassive, but she caught the brief flash of something, anger, perhaps, or calculation, before his expression returned to its usual composed mask. "Your ancestors never faced an enemy with the technological advantages of the Sokoto," he replied carefully. "Sometimes wisdom lies in knowing when a battle cannot be won." The princess set down her cup with deliberate precision, the soft clink of gold against wood seeming to echo through the chamber. Outside, the evening call to prayer drifted across the city, but inside this room, she felt the first stirrings of a doubt that would soon consume everything she thought she knew about loyalty and trust. Sleep eluded Princess Amma as she paced the royal chambers, her bare feet silent against the cool stone floors. Through the latticed windows, she could see the lights of Kumasi spread out like stars fallen to earth, each flame representing a life that depended upon her decisions in the days ahead. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon her shoulders like a physical burden, and for the first time since ascending to the throne, she truly understood the weariness that had marked her father's final years. Power, she realized, was not the ability to command others, but the crushing obligation to make choices that would echo through generations. The royal archives lay open before her, ancient texts written in the old script that few could still read fluently. Here were the true histories of the Ashanti people, not the simplified tales told to children, but the complex accounts of sacrifice and compromise that had built their golden kingdom. One passage caught her attention, written in her great-grandfather's careful hand. "A ruler who will not sacrifice for their people deserves neither throne nor crown." The words seemed to glow in the lamplight, and Amma felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that her ancestors had faced similar impossible choices. The crimson spear called to her from its chamber below, its dark promise growing stronger with each passing hour. Soon, she would have to decide whether the salvation of her people was worth the price of her soul. The morning brought an unexpected visitor to the palace gates, a Sokoto diplomat riding under a flag of truce, his iron armor gleaming despite the dust of long travel. General Kwaku personally escorted the man to the throne room, and Amma noted how readily her trusted advisor seemed to communicate with the enemy emissary. Their conversation flowed too smoothly, as if they had rehearsed these diplomatic niceties before. The diplomat, a lean man with intelligent eyes and scars that spoke of countless battles, delivered his master's ultimatum with the precision of a well-honed blade. "The great Sultan Muhammadu offers terms of vassalage," he announced, producing a scroll sealed with black wax. "Acknowledge the supremacy of the Sokoto Empire, provide tribute in gold and warriors, and your people will be spared the devastation of war." The assembled court listened in tense silence as he continued, outlining the specific requirements: half of all gold production, first rights to all trade routes, and the education of noble children in Sokoto schools to ensure their loyalty to the empire. Amma felt the eyes of the clan chiefs upon her, some hopeful that she might accept these terms, others burning with the fury of proud warriors who would rather die than submit. But her attention remained fixed on General Kwaku, whose face betrayed a satisfaction that no loyal advisor should feel when hearing such demands. The seed of suspicion that had been planted in her heart began to sprout dark leaves. That night, Amma descended once more to the chamber of the Crimson Spear, but this time she was not alone. The high priestess Nana Akodo awaited her, the elderly woman's face grave in the flickering torchlight. For 60 years, the priestess had served as keeper of the kingdom's most dangerous secrets, and her presence confirmed what Amma had already begun to suspect. The time for half measures and diplomatic solutions had passed. The spear lay before them, its crimson shaft seeming to pulse with a life of its own, and Nana Akodo began to recite the ancient words that would bind weapon to wielder. "The pact was made in blood and sorrow," the priestess intoned, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "King Osei Tutu accepted the burden so that his people might live free. Each victory feeds the weapon. Each triumph costs the wielder a piece of their humanity." She lifted the spear from its cradle with reverent care, and Amma felt the air in the chamber grow thick with power. The weapon was beautiful and terrible, its point sharp enough to pierce any armor, its shaft carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the torchlight. "Once taken up, it cannot be easily set aside," Nana Akodo warned. "The spear will demand its price, and that price grows heavier with each battle won." Amma reached out with trembling fingers, knowing that this moment would mark the end of her old life and the beginning of something far more terrible and necessary. The moment Amma's fingers closed around the crimson spear's shaft, the world exploded into sensation. Power flowed through her like liquid fire, burning away weakness and doubt while filling her with strength beyond mortal comprehension. But beneath the exhilaration lurked something darker, a hunger that was not her own, an ancient thirst for blood and victory that whispered seductive promises in her mind. The spear had chosen her, just as it had chosen her ancestor, and she could feel its approval like a warm embrace that slowly tightened into chains. Nana Akodo watched with eyes that held both pride and profound sadness as the transformation began. The princess's appearance remained unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted in her bearing, a predatory grace that spoke of supernatural enhancement, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "You feel it now," the priestess said softly, "the power that can unite armies and topple empires. But remember, child, that every gift demands payment. The spear will make you a great warrior, a brilliant tactician, a leader that others will follow into the very jaws of death. But it will also feed upon your compassion, your mercy, your humanity." Amma barely heard the warning, so intoxicated was she by the flood of tactical knowledge and martial skill that poured into her mind. She could see the coming war with perfect clarity now, every possible strategy, every weakness in the enemy's advance, every opportunity for victory. The price seemed almost trivial compared to such magnificent power. When Princess Amma strode into the war council the following morning, every person in the room felt the change immediately. Where once had stood a young woman burdened by impossible choices, now stood a figure that radiated authority and barely contained violence. The crimson spear rested across her back, its presence like a storm cloud waiting to unleash thunder. Chief Osei was the first to speak, his weathered voice cracking with emotion. "My princess, you cannot mean to wield that accursed thing. The legends, "The legends speak truth," Amma interrupted, her voice carrying a resonance that made the golden ornaments throughout the room chime softly. "But they also speak of victory. The Sokoto bring iron and fire. We shall meet them with something far older and more terrible." She moved to the great map table with fluid grace, and her finger traced the enemy's line of advance with uncanny precision. "Here, at the crossing of the Pra River, we will make our stand. The terrain favors us, and they will not expect such bold defiance." General Kwaku shifted uncomfortably, his carefully laid plans crumbling in the face of this new development. He had counted on the princess's inexperience, and the clan chief's fear to deliver the kingdom into Sokoto hands without a devastating war. Now, faced with a ruler transformed by ancient power, he would have to accelerate his own timetable for betrayal. The reaction of the 7 clan chiefs to their transformed princess varied like the facets of a cut gem. Chief Yaw of the Asona bowed deeply, his warrior's heart recognizing the power that now flowed through her veins. "If you command it, we shall gather every spear and shield in the kingdom," he declared, his voice ringing with renewed hope. But Chief Ebo of the Ekuona clan stepped back, his face pale with superstitious dread. "That weapon is cursed," he whispered. "It devoured King Osai Tutu's soul and left him a shell of his former self. Would you doom yourself to the same fate?" Amma turned her gaze upon each chief in turn, and they felt the weight of her enhanced perception like a physical pressure. She could see their loyalties now, written in the subtle tensions of their bodies and the flickering patterns of their thoughts. Most would follow her, driven by desperation, and the hope that the legendary weapon might indeed turn the tide. But some wavered, their fear of the spear's curse warring with their duty to the crown. "I do not ask you to make this sacrifice," she told them, her words cutting through their doubts like a blade through silk. "I have already made it. The question now is whether you will stand with me when the Iron Legions come, or whether you will flee and leave our people to slavery and death." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and one by one, the chiefs knelt in acceptance of their transformed queen's leadership. Under cover of night, General Kwaku made his way to an abandoned shrine on the outskirts of Kumasi, where the Sokoto diplomat waited with the patience of a hunting cat. The meeting had been arranged days ago, when Kwaku still believed he could deliver the kingdom through negotiation rather than conquest. Now, with the crimson spear in Amma's hands, the situation had become far more complex and dangerous. The diplomat, who had given his name as Captain Rashid, smiled coldly as Kwaku approached. "Your princess has made an interesting choice," he observed. "Our spies report that she now carries the legendary weapon of her ancestors." Kwaku's face remained impassive, though his heart hammered with the rhythm of a war drum. "The spear is powerful, but it comes with a terrible cost. Each victory will make her stronger, yes, but also less human. Eventually, it will consume her entirely." Captain Rashid nodded thoughtfully, his scarred hands tracing patterns in the dust at his feet. "Then we must ensure that she does not have the opportunity to win many victories. Can you deliver her to us before the curse makes her too dangerous to approach?" The question hung between them like a blade poised to fall, and Kwaku felt the last vestiges of his loyalty to the crown crumble into ash. He had served 3 generations of Ashanti royalty, but survival demanded adaptation, and the Sokoto Empire represented the future, while the Golden Kingdom was merely clinging to a glorious past. The great horn of Kumasi sounded at dawn, its deep voice carrying across the savannah for miles in every direction. It was a call that had not been heard for 2 generations, the ancient summons that commanded every warrior of the 7 clans to gather beneath the golden banner. From mud-brick villages and forest strongholds they came, carrying spears tipped with iron bought from northern traders, shields decorated with the symbols of their lineages, and hearts heavy with the knowledge that they marched toward a war that would determine the fate of their people. Princess Amma stood atop the palace walls, watching the streams of warriors converge upon her capital like tributaries flowing toward a great river. The crimson spear had already begun to change her, sharpening her senses, until she could distinguish individual conversations among the thousands gathering below. She could smell their fear and determination, could hear the whispered prayers to ancestors and the quiet sobs of wives bidding farewell to husbands who might never return. The weapon's hunger stirred within her, anticipating the battles to come, but she pushed it down with an effort of will that left her trembling. General Kwaku approached from behind, his footsteps careful and measured. "The clans are answering your call," he reported, his voice carefully neutral. "We will have perhaps 15,000 warriors when all are assembled." Amma nodded without turning, her enhanced perception catching the subtle wrongness in his tone. The seeds of suspicion she had been nurturing began to bloom into certainty. 3 days after the great gathering began, a Sokoto raiding party struck at the village of Dunkwa, testing the Ashanti response and seeking to gauge the effectiveness of their enemy's mobilization. The attack came at dawn, 50 ironclad horsemen thundering out of the morning mist to fall upon the unsuspecting settlement like wolves among sheep. But Princess Amma had been expecting such a probe, her spear-enhanced tactical awareness allowing her to position scouts and rapid response forces with supernatural precision. When the alarm drums sounded, she was already mounted and riding hard toward the threatened village, the crimson spear singing with anticipation across her back. The battle that followed lasted mere minutes, but it announced to both sides that the war had truly begun. Amma arrived as the raiders were still burning the grain stores, her small force of elite warriors falling upon the surprised Sokoto cavalry with devastating effect. The crimson spear moved in her hands like a living thing, its point finding gaps in armor with impossible accuracy, while its shaft turned aside sword strokes that should have proved fatal. When the last enemy warrior fell, she stood among the corpses feeling the weapon's dark satisfaction as it fed upon the victory. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, power flowing through her like wine, knowledge of warfare flooding her mind, but also something cold and alien taking root in her heart. The survivors of Dunkwa knelt before her with awe and terror, recognizing that their princess had become something more and less than human. That night, as Amma cleaned the enemy blood from the crimson spear's point, she noticed the first visible sign of the weapon's influence. Her reflection in the polished bronze mirror showed eyes that glowed with a faint crimson light, and when she smiled, her teeth seemed sharper than before. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. The curse was already working its transformation upon her flesh as well as her spirit. Nana Akoto entered the tent without invitation, her aged face grave with concern. "You feel it now, don't you?" the priestess asked. "The hunger, the coldness creeping into your heart. This is only the beginning, child." Amma set down the spear with careful precision, fighting the urge to keep it always within reach. "How long do I have?" she asked, surprising herself with the calm acceptance in her voice. "Before it consumes me entirely." Nana Akoto shook her head sadly. "Your ancestor wielded it for 7 years before the change became complete, but he fought against armies of mortals armed with bronze and wood. You face an empire with weapons of iron and tactics learned through centuries of conquest. The battles will be harder, the victories more costly, and the spear will feed more deeply with each triumph." The old woman reached out to touch Amma's cheek, and her fingers came away warm with tears the princess had not realized she was shedding. "Use the time you have wisely, child. Win your war quickly or lose yourself in the process." General Kwaku stood before the assembled war council, his weathered features betraying nothing of the turmoil within. The victory at Dunkwa had electrified the kingdom, proving that the Sokoto were not invincible and that their iron weapons could be overcome by superior tactics and supernatural power. But it had also demonstrated just how dangerous Princess Amma was becoming, and how quickly the Crimson Spear was transforming her into something beyond mortal understanding. His carefully crafted plans for a negotiated surrender were crumbling, replaced by the growing necessity for more direct action. "The enemy will not underestimate us again," he warned the assembled chiefs, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military experience. They will come in greater numbers with better preparation, and they will not hesitate to burn everything in their path. Chief Yawn nodded grimly, his scarred hands tracing patterns on the map spread before them. Then we must strike first, before they can marshal their full strength. The princess has shown us that they can be beaten. Kwaku's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Asona chief's enthusiasm was shared by most of the others, their earlier doubts swept away by the intoxicating taste of victory. But Kwaku could see the larger picture. The Sokoto Empire commanded resources that dwarfed those of the Ashanti kingdom, and even a weapon of legendary power could not overcome such overwhelming odds. Soon, he would have to choose between loyalty to a doomed cause and the survival of his people. The choice, he told himself, was already made. 500 miles to the north, in the great fortress city of Sokoto, Sultan Muhammadu received word of the Dunkwa defeat with cold fury. The loss of 50 elite cavalry was painful, but the manner of their destruction was deeply troubling. His scouts reported that the Ashanti princess now wielded a weapon of supernatural power, one that had turned the tide of battle with devastating effect. Standing before the great map that dominated his war room, the Sultan studied the reports with the calculating mind that had built an empire from the scattered kingdoms of the savannah. "Summon General Usman," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. General Usman arrived within the hour, his iron armor gleaming despite the dust of constant campaigning. He was a man carved from stone and sharpened by a lifetime of warfare, one of the few commanders the Sultan trusted with independent command. "You have read the reports from the south?" the Sultan inquired, his eyes never leaving the map. Usman nodded grimly. "A weapon of power, wielded by a warrior of skill, but power corrupts and legendary weapons carry curses as well as blessings. We need only be patient and strike when the curse has weakened her." The Sultan's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. "Patience is a virtue, old friend, but so is decisive action. Double the southern army. If the Ashanti princess wishes to test her cursed spear against the might of Sokoto, we shall accommodate her desire. And send word to our friend in Kumasi. The time for subtlety has passed." The dreams came to Princess Amma with increasing frequency now. Visions granted by the crimson spear that showed possible futures spreading out like branches of an ancient tree. In some, she saw herself leading triumphant armies across the savannah, the golden banner of Ashanti flying over conquered cities while enemy warriors knelt in submission. In others, she witnessed the burning of Kumasi, her people enslaved or dead, while the Sokoto Empire expanded its borders ever southward. But the most disturbing visions were those that showed her own transformation, images of herself standing victorious but hollow-eyed, the spear having consumed everything human within her until only a weapon remained in the shape of a woman. She woke from these prophetic nightmares with sweat cooling on her skin and the taste of blood in her mouth, though she could not remember biting her tongue. The crimson spear leaned against the wall beside her sleeping mat, its presence a constant reminder of the price she had accepted for the power to save her people. Sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, she wondered if there might have been another way, some path of negotiation or strategic retreat that could have preserved both kingdom and soul. But such thoughts were quickly banished by the weapon's influence, which whispered that strength was the only virtue that mattered, and that sacrifice was the currency by which great deeds were purchased. The curse was patient but inexorable, and she could feel it working upon her mind like water slowly wearing away stone. As the days passed and the army continued to grow, the clan chiefs began to notice subtle changes in their transformed princess that went beyond the obvious signs of the spear's influence. Chief Osei, whose long experience with warfare had taught him to read the signs of impending battle madness, watched Amma with growing concern during the daily war councils. Her tactical brilliance was undeniable. She could see patterns in troop movements that escaped even veteran commanders, and her strategies consistently anticipated enemy actions with supernatural accuracy. But there was a coldness creeping into her words, a dismissive arrogance when discussing the lives that would be lost in the coming battles. Chief Igbo of the Ekuona clan was the first to voice his concerns openly, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man walking through a field of thorns. "My princess, your tactical genius serves us well, but I fear we may be moving too quickly toward a confrontation that will cost us dearly." Amma's gaze fixed upon him with predatory intensity, and he felt his courage waver beneath that supernatural scrutiny. "Are you questioning my judgment, Chief Igbo?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an undertone that made the other chiefs shift uncomfortably. "Or perhaps you believe we should accept the Sokoto terms and live as slaves?" The challenge was clear, and Igbo's response would determine not only his own fate but the nature of the kingdom's leadership going forward. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, and in the silence, the crimson spear seemed to pulse with anticipation. That evening, General Kwaku found himself alone with his thoughts and a half-empty bottle of palm wine, wrestling with the impossible choice that lay before him. Through the window of his private chambers, he could see the campfires of the assembled army stretching across the plain like fallen stars, each flame representing warriors who trusted him to lead them wisely into battle. Many of these men had served under his command for years, following him through border skirmishes and cattle raids with unwavering loyalty. Now, he was being asked to betray them all for the promise of survival under Sokoto rule. The message from Captain Rashid lay open on his table, its contents making clear that the time for half measures had passed. The Sultan demanded immediate action. The assassination of Princess Amma before her power could grow beyond all control, followed by the surrender of the kingdom under terms that would spare the common people, but eliminate the noble class entirely. Kwaku's hands shook as he poured another measure of wine, the amber liquid catching the lamplight like liquid gold. He had convinced himself that betrayal was necessary for the greater good, that submission to the Sokoto Empire would preserve more lives than a hopeless war against overwhelming odds. But looking out at those countless fires, he wondered if survival purchased with treachery was worth the price. The wine tasted like ashes in his mouth as he contemplated the magnitude of what he was being asked to do. Princess Amma moved through the camp like a shadow given form, the crimson spear across her back humming with contained power. Sleep had become increasingly elusive as the weapon's influence grew stronger, replaced by a restless energy that demanded action and violence. The enhanced senses granted by the curse allowed her to navigate the darkness with supernatural ease, hearing conversations from tent to tent, and smelling the complex mix of emotions that permeated the army's encampment. Fear and excitement, determination and doubt, all the usual cocktail of feelings that preceded a major battle. But tonight she sensed something else, a wrongness that set her teeth on edge and made the spear's hunger stir restlessly. Someone in the camp was harboring treacherous thoughts, their guilt and anxiety creating a sour note in the symphony of sounds and scents that surrounded her. The weapon whispered suggestions in her mind, urging her to seek out the source of this corruption and eliminate it with the decisive violence that had always served her ancestors well. She paused beside General Kwaku's tent, her nostrils flaring as she detected the familiar scent of his presence mixed with something else, paper and ink, the smell of secret correspondence. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment the human part of her soul cried out in anguish at the implications. But the spear's influence quickly smothered that weakness, replacing grief with cold, calculating fury. Dawn was still an hour away when Amma entered Kwaku's tent without ceremony, her enhanced reflexes allowing her to move silently past the sleeping guards. The general woke instantly, decades of military training bringing him to full alertness even as his hand reached instinctively for the sword at his bedside. But he froze when he saw her standing there, the crimson spear in her hands and her eyes glowing with that supernatural crimson light. The letter from Captain Rashid lay open on his table, its damning contents visible in the lamplight that flickered between them. 20 years, she said quietly, her voice carrying no emotion that he could identify. 20 years you served my father, helped raise me from a child, stood at my side through every crisis and triumph. Was it all pretense, General? Or did your loyalty simply have a price that the Sokoto were willing to meet? Kwaku slowly raised his hands, showing that he held no weapons, though they both knew that mortal steel would be useless against her now. You don't understand, he said desperately. The Empire is too strong, their armies too vast. I hoped we could find a way to surrender with honor, to preserve some remnant of our people's freedom. The spear pulsed in her grip, its hunger growing stronger as it sensed the potential for violence. The curse whispered that betrayal could only be answered with death, that mercy was a luxury the strong could not afford. But somewhere deep within her transformed soul, the human part of Amma wept for the man who had taught her to ride and fight, who had been like a second father when her real father grew distant with the burdens of kingship. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the soft crackling of the lamp flame and the distant sounds of the camp slowly awakening to face another day of preparation. Kwaku's confession hung in the air between them, and Amma felt the terrible weight of judgment settling upon her shoulders. The crimson spear urged swift execution, traitors deserved death, and hesitation was a weakness that enemies could exploit. But the princess within her, the part that remembered childhood lessons and shared laughter, struggled against the weapon's influence with desperate determination. You could have come to me, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Shared your concerns, argued for a different path. Instead, you chose to treat with our enemies behind my back, to conspire in the betrayal of everything we've sworn to protect. Kwaku's weathered face crumpled with shame and regret, and she saw in his expression the man who had once been her trusted advisor rather than the traitor he had become. The curse has already changed you more than you realize, he replied, his voice heavy with sorrow. The princess I raised would never have considered wielding that accursed weapon. The Amma I knew would have found another way. His words struck her like physical blows, and for a moment she wavered, seeing herself through his eyes, transformed by dark magic into something her younger self would have feared and fled from. The spear's hunger pulsed impatiently, demanding that she silence this voice of doubt and conscience before it could weaken her resolve further. The moment of decision arrived with the inexorable weight of destiny, and Princess Amma made a choice that would echo through all the days that followed. Instead of striking down the man who had betrayed her trust, she lowered the crimson spear and stepped back, her enhanced senses detecting the way Kwaku's entire body sagged with relief and surprise. You will leave, she commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a queen. Take whatever personal possessions you can carry and go. Never return to Ashanti lands, never take up arms against us, and perhaps you will live long enough to find some measure of peace with what you've done. Kwaku stared at her in amazement, clearly having expected a swift death for his treachery. My princess, he began, but she cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. Do not mistake mercy for weakness, she warned, and he could hear the spear's influence threading through her words like poison through honey. I spare you because the man you once were deserved better than the traitor you became. But if you linger, if you hesitate, if you give me cause to reconsider this decision, I will not be so generous again. The weapon in her hands pulsed with frustrated hunger, denied the blood it craved, and she felt a part of herself die as she turned away from the satisfying violence it promised. This act of mercy would cost her dearly. She could feel the curse's displeasure like ice in her veins, a reminder that every moment of human weakness made her transformation more difficult to resist. By midday, word had spread throughout the camp that General Kwaku had departed in disgrace, though the exact nature of his offense remained shrouded in carefully maintained secrecy. Princess Amma watched from her command tent as her former mentor's horse disappeared into the northern wilderness, carrying away 20 years of shared history, and the last person who remembered her, as she had been before the spear's influence began its inexorable work. The assembled war council waited for her explanation, their faces showing the confusion and concern that such a sudden change in leadership inevitably produced. Chief Yaw was the first to break the uncomfortable silence, his warrior's instincts recognizing that questions of command structure could not be left unresolved on the eve of battle. "Who will lead our forces in Kwaku's absence?" he asked bluntly. "The clans need to know the chain of command before we face the Sokoto." Amma turned from the tent flap, and those present felt the full weight of her transformed presence settle upon them like a heavy cloak. "I will lead them myself," she declared, her voice carrying a certainty that left no room for debate. "The Crimson Spear grants more than supernatural strength. It bestows the tactical genius of all who have wielded it before. My ancestors' knowledge flows through me now, and I see the patterns of war with perfect clarity." The chiefs exchanged worried glances, recognizing that their princess was claiming abilities that no mortal ruler had ever possessed. But they also saw the crimson glow in her eyes and felt the power that radiated from her transformed form, and none dared to challenge her assertion directly. 3 days after Kwaku's departure, the Sokoto host came into view across the northern plains like a dark storm rolling toward the Ashanti positions. Their numbers were vast, easily twice the size of the defending army, and their iron weapons glittered in the afternoon sun like the scales of some enormous serpent. At their head rode General Usman, his presence marked by the great black banner that had flown over a dozen conquered cities, while behind him came regiment after regiment of disciplined infantry and swift cavalry that had crushed every army they had faced. Princess Amma stood atop the highest watchtower in the fortified camp her forces had constructed at the Pra River crossing, her enhanced vision allowing her to study the enemy formation with supernatural clarity. The Crimson Spear had indeed granted her the tactical knowledge of her ancestors, and she could see the strengths and weaknesses of the approaching host as clearly as if they had been marked upon a map. Their discipline was impressive, their equipment superior, but they carried the arrogance of an army that had never faced true defeat. That arrogance would be their downfall, for they expected to face mere mortals armed with bronze and wood, not a weapon forged in the ancient days when the world was younger and magic flowed more freely through mortal hands. The curse whispered suggestions in her mind, strategies of devastating efficiency that would maximize enemy casualties while minimizing her own losses. Each plan was more ruthless than the last, and she found herself embracing that ruthlessness with growing enthusiasm as the human part of her soul continued its steady retreat before the spear's relentless influence. The evening before the great battle, Princess Amma walked among her warriors with the Crimson Spear strapped across her back, its presence serving as both talisman and terrible promise. The men gathered around their cooking fires looked up as she passed, and she could read their faces like open scrolls, hope and fear warring in equal measure, determination tempered by the natural human reluctance to face death in battle. Some had heard the legends of the weapon she carried and drew courage from its reputation, while others whispered of the curse that came with its power and wondered if their princess was damning herself for their sake. At each fire, she stopped to share words of encouragement, her enhanced senses allowing her to tailor her message to each group's particular concerns and fears. To the young warriors facing their first major battle, she spoke of the honor they would win and the stories their children would tell of this day. To the veterans who had seen too many friends die in lesser conflicts, she acknowledged their sacrifice while promising that this battle would end the threat that had haunted their borders for too long. But even as she spoke these words of comfort and inspiration, she could feel the spear's influence coloring her thoughts, making her see these men not as individuals with hopes and fears, but as pieces on a great game board to be moved and sacrificed as tactical necessity demanded. The realization should have horrified her, but instead she found it oddly liberating. Leadership was so much simpler when one was not burdened by excessive concern for individual lives. The battle began before sunrise, As General Usman launched a probing attack designed to test the Ashanti defenses and identify weak points that could be exploited in the main assault. His cavalry came thundering across the plain in loose formation, their iron-shod hooves raising clouds of dust that turned the early morning air into a choking haze. But Princess Amma had anticipated this tactic, her spear granted insights allowing her to position her own forces with supernatural precision. Hidden archer companies rose from carefully concealed positions, sending volleys of arrows into the advancing horsemen, while spear formations emerged from behind earthworks to present an impenetrable barrier of bronze points. The crimson spear sang in Amma's hands as she led the countercharge, its point seeking enemy flesh with the hunger of a living thing. Each thrust was perfectly placed, finding gaps in armor or striking at weak points that mortal eyes could never have detected. The weapon's power flowed through her like liquid fire, granting strength beyond human limits and speed that turned her into a blur of crimson death among the enemy ranks. But with each life she took, she felt the curse tighten its grip upon her soul, feeding on the violence while slowly consuming the compassion and mercy that had once defined her character. The Sokoto cavalry broke before her supernatural assault, their survivors fleeing back across the plain to carry word of the terrible weapon that had shattered their charge. General Usman watched their retreat through his spyglass, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that this would not be the easy victory his sultan had promised. As the morning progressed, the intensity of the fighting escalated beyond anything the savannah had witnessed in living memory. Wave after wave of Sokoto infantry crashed against the Ashanti defensive positions, their iron weapons and superior numbers gradually wearing down the resistance, despite the supernatural presence of their enemy's cursed weapon. Princess Amma moved through the battle like an avatar of war itself, the crimson spear carving paths of destruction through the enemy ranks, while her tactical brilliance allowed her to anticipate and counter every assault before it could achieve its objectives. But the spear's hunger grew with each victory, and she could feel it pulling at her consciousness like a tide that threatened to sweep away everything human within her. The faces of the enemy warriors she slew began to blur together into a single mass of flesh to be harvested, while the cries of her own wounded soldiers became merely background noise to be ignored unless they affected tactical considerations. Chief Yaw, fighting nearby with his clan warriors, caught glimpses of her transformation and felt his blood run cold. The princess he had served faithfully for years was disappearing before his eyes, replaced by something that wore her face but moved with the predatory grace of a supernatural predator. Each time the spear fed upon enemy blood, the crimson glow in her eyes grew brighter, and her smile became more terrible to behold. By midday, the tide of battle had turned decisively in favor of the Ashanti forces. The combination of Princess Amma's supernatural prowess and tactical genius had shattered 3 separate Sokoto assaults, leaving the field littered with enemy dead, while her own losses remained remarkably light. General Usman found himself in the unfamiliar position of considering retreat, his confidence shaken by the repeated failure of tactics that had never failed him before. The cursed spear was proving to be everything the legends claimed, a weapon that could turn the tide of any battle through sheer supernatural power. But victory came with a price that grew heavier with each passing hour. Amma stood among the corpses of her enemies, the crimson spear dripping with blood that seemed to smoke in the afternoon heat, and felt the last vestiges of her human compassion withering away like flowers in a drought. The weapon whispered seductive promises of greater victories to come, of enemies broken and kingdoms conquered, all purchased with the steady erosion of everything that had once made her more than just another conqueror with a sharp blade. When a wounded Sokoto soldier raised his hand in surrender, she struck him down without hesitation, the spear's hunger overriding any impulse toward mercy. The act should have horrified her, but instead she felt only a cold satisfaction at the efficiency of the kill. Nana Akoto's warning seemed like distant echoes now, overwhelmed by the intoxicating rush of power and the promise of absolute victory that the curse dangled before her transformed consciousness. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, General Usman made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. His conventional tactics had failed utterly against the supernatural power of the Crimson Spear, and his army was bleeding strength with each failed assault. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and he had brought one final gambit from the distant arsenals of the Sokoto Empire. Weapons of fire and iron that could level fortifications and scatter armies, purchased from Portuguese traders who cared nothing for the carnage their creations would unleash. The first cannon shots announced this new phase of the battle with thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Great iron balls whistled through the air to crash among the Ashanti positions, each impact sending defenders flying like leaves before a hurricane. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Men who had stood firm against cavalry charges and infantry assaults broke and ran at the sound of these terrible weapons, their minds unable to process the sheer destructive power of firearms on a scale they had never imagined. Princess Amma felt the spear's rage at this development, its hunger frustrated by enemies who could strike from beyond the reach of even supernatural speed and strength. For the first time since taking up the cursed weapon, she experienced something approaching fear, though the emotion was quickly transmuted into cold fury by the spear's influence. The tide of battle was turning once again, and she would need every scrap of power the weapon could grant if she hoped to salvage victory from this new disaster. The cannon barrage continued for what seemed like hours, each thunderous impact sending shockwaves through the Ashanti defensive positions and leaving craters in the earth that smoked with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Princess Amma's supernatural reflexes allowed her to avoid the worst of the bombardment, but even she could not be everywhere at once, and her warriors were dying in numbers that made her previous light casualties seem like a fond memory. The Crimson Spear pulsed with frustrated energy, its power useless against enemies who fought from a distance with weapons that could kill without honor or skill. Chief Os found her crouched behind the shattered remains of an earthwork, her eyes blazing with crimson fury as she watched her army slowly disintegrate under the relentless artillery assault. "We must retreat," he urged, ducking as another cannonball whistled overhead. "These weapons are beyond anything we prepared for. Our men cannot fight what they cannot reach." Amma's response was a snarl that held nothing human in its tone. "Retreat is defeat, and defeat is unacceptable. The spear demands victory, and victory I shall give it." The curse had progressed further than even she realized, subsuming her tactical judgment beneath an overwhelming hunger for triumph at any cost. She could see a path to victory even now, a desperate gamble that would require her to abandon her remaining humanity entirely, but which might yet turn this disaster into the greatest triumph in Ashanti history. The choice was no choice at all, for the woman who had once been Princess Amma was already dead, killed by inches with each life the spear had claimed. What happened next would be remembered in whispered legends for centuries to come. Princess Amma rose from her defensive position with the Crimson Spear held high above her head, and her voice carried across the battlefield with supernatural resonance as she called upon powers that had slept since the world was young. The weapon responded to her desperate need by offering its ultimate gift, complete transformation from mortal flesh into something that existed purely to wage war and claim victory. She accepted without hesitation, feeling her remaining humanity burn away like dross in a forge as the spear's curse reached its final culmination. The change was visible to every warrior on the battlefield, friend and foe alike. Princess Amma's form became wreathed in crimson fire that hurt to look upon directly, while her eyes blazed with the light of dying stars. The Crimson Spear melded with her flesh, becoming an extension of her, rather than merely a weapon she wielded. Power flowed through her transformed body in torrents that made her previous enhancements seem like gentle breezes, and she could feel the terrified awe of every soul within miles as they witnessed her apotheosis into something beyond mortal understanding. The cannonballs that had been tearing her army apart suddenly seemed as slow as falling leaves, easily avoided or deflected by her supernatural awareness. She had gained the power to win this battle and save her people, but the price was the complete destruction of everything that had made her human. The spear had finally claimed its ultimate victory, not over any enemy army, but over the soul of the woman who had dared to wield it. What had once been Princess Amma moved across the battlefield like a force of nature unleashed, her transformed state allowing her to cover impossible distances in the space between heartbeats. The Sokoto cannoneers, so confident in their technological superiority, found themselves facing something that their weapons had never been designed to combat. She appeared among their artillery positions like a crimson nightmare, the spear that was now part of her essence carving through iron and flesh with equal ease. Each cannon destroyed sent shockwaves through the enemy ranks, for they had counted on their firearms to provide an insurmountable advantage. General Usman watched in horror as his carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos, his disciplined regiments breaking apart like sand castles before a tsunami. The legends spoke of weapons of power from the ancient days, but he had dismissed such tales as primitive superstition. Now he faced the terrible reality of what happened when desperate necessity unlocked forces that wise men had sealed away for good reason. His own sword felt like a child's toy in his hands, as he watched the avatar that had been the Ashanti princess tear through his elite guards, each movement perfect and economical in its deadly efficiency. This was no longer a battle between armies. It had become a slaughter orchestrated by something that existed purely to wage war and claim victory. He gave the order to retreat, knowing that his career and possibly his life were forfeit, but unable to watch any more of his men die uselessly against an opponent they had no hope of defeating. The battle ended as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky the same crimson shade as the supernatural fire that still wreathed the transformed figure standing among the scattered remnants of two armies. The Sokoto forces fled in complete disorder, their morale shattered by the encounter with power beyond their comprehension, while the surviving Ashanti warriors knelt at a respectful distance from their transfigured queen. Victory was complete and absolute, exactly as the Crimson Spear had promised, but the cost had been far higher than any of them could have imagined. Chief Yaw approached cautiously, his weathered face showing the strain of watching his beloved princess disappear into something that wore her shape but moved with inhuman grace. My lady," he said hesitantly, unsure how to address this being that had once been the child he had helped raise. The avatar turned its blazing gaze upon him, and he felt his knees buckle under the weight of that supernatural scrutiny. When it spoke, the voice carried echoes of the woman he had known, but overlaid with harmonics that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "The enemy is broken," it announced, its tone carrying satisfaction but no warmth. "The kingdom is safe. The spear's hunger is sated. For now." The last two words hung in the air like a promise and a threat, for everyone present understood that this victory had merely fed the curse rather than ending it. The woman who had sacrificed herself to save her people was gone, replaced by something that would always hunger for the next battle, the next conquest, the next opportunity to prove its terrible power. In the days that followed the great victory at Pra River, the full magnitude of what had been gained and lost became apparent to the surviving leadership of the Ashanti kingdom. The Sokoto threat had been eliminated. Reports from fleeing merchants and scattered refugees indicated that General Usman's shattered army had retreated far beyond the northern borders, carrying tales of supernatural terror that would discourage any future invasions for generations to come. The 7 clans were safe. Their children would grow up free from the shadow of foreign conquest, and the Golden Kingdom would endure as it had for centuries past. But the cost of that salvation walked among them like a living reminder of the price that power demanded. The being that had once been Princess Amma maintained her royal chambers and attended the necessary ceremonies of state, but everyone who interacted with her could feel the fundamental wrongness that surrounded her transformed presence. She spoke with perfect tactical knowledge about the defense of the realm, made decisions with supernatural insight into the consequences of each choice, and wielded authority with an efficiency that no mortal ruler could match. Yet there was no warmth in her voice, no compassion in her crimson gaze, no trace of the woman who had once wept for the fate of her people and agonized over the necessity of wielding the cursed spear. Nana Akodo had been right. The weapon had granted victory, but it had devoured the soul of the one who wielded it, leaving behind only a hollow shell filled with the hunger for war. The formal victory celebration lasted for 3 days, as tradition demanded, but the festivities felt forced and hollow to those who remembered what their princess had been before her transformation. The avatar that wore her face performed all the expected rituals with perfect precision, accepting the praise of the clan chiefs, distributing rewards to the surviving warriors, and making pronouncements about the future of the kingdom that displayed supernatural wisdom but no human emotion. The people cheered because they were expected to cheer, but their eyes held the same wary distance that prey animals showed when a predator passed nearby. Chief Os made the mistake of referring to the old days during one of the victory speeches, mentioning how proud Princess Amma's father would have been to see his daughter's triumph. The avatar's gaze fixed upon him with laser intensity, and when it spoke, its voice carried undertones that made every person present feel as though ice water had been poured down their spine. "That woman is dead," it announced with the finality of a funeral bell. "She died willingly so that you might live free. Do not dishonor her sacrifice by pretending she still exists." The silence that followed stretched for long moments, broken only by the distant sound of celebration from the common quarters where the people danced and sang, unaware of the conversation taking place in the royal pavilion. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Whatever had been human in their princess had been consumed by the spear's hunger, leaving behind only the avatar of war that would rule them with supernatural efficiency, but no love. In the weeks following the victory, the avatar began implementing changes to the kingdom's structure that reflected its transformed nature and priorities. The old advisory council was dissolved, replaced by a war council that existed solely to prepare for future conflicts and maintain the military readiness that the cursed weapon demanded. Diplomatic missions were sent to neighboring kingdoms not to establish trade relationships or cultural exchanges, but to assess potential threats and identify opportunities for expansion. The Golden Kingdom, which had once prided itself on wise governance and prosperous peace, was being systematically converted into a machine designed for one purpose: war. The avatar's supernatural insights allowed it to identify inefficiencies and weaknesses in the traditional systems with ruthless clarity, and its recommendations were always implemented without question or debate. Taxes were restructured to maximize military funding. Trade policies were adjusted to prioritize the acquisition of weapons and strategic materials, and the education of noble children was modified to emphasize martial training over cultural refinement. Each change was logical and effective from a purely tactical standpoint, but collectively, they represented the transformation of an entire civilization to serve the needs of a cursed weapon rather than the happiness of its people. Chief Yaw watched these developments with growing unease, recognizing that they were witnessing the birth of something that would eventually consume not just their enemies, but everything the Ashanti kingdom had once stood for. Not everyone accepted the new order with resignation. In the quiet corners of Kumasi's markets and the shadowed alcoves of clan meeting halls, voices began to whisper of resistance and rebellion. The avatar's supernatural senses detected these stirrings of discontent with perfect clarity, but rather than responding with the brutal suppression that a traditional tyrant might employ, it chose a more subtle and terrifying approach. Those who spoke against the new regime simply disappeared in the night, vanishing without trace or explanation, their absence serving as a more effective deterrent than any public execution could have provided. Chief Ebo of the Ekuona clan found himself visited by the Avatar in his private chambers one night, awakening to find the transformed being standing beside his bed like a figure from a fevered dream. "You have concerns about my governance," it observed, its voice carrying no anger but also no warmth. "Speak them freely. I am curious to understand the source of your dissatisfaction." The chief's mouth went dry as he stared up at those blazing crimson eyes, knowing that his life hung by a thread thinner than spider silk. You have saved us all," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "But in saving us, you have become something that our ancestors would not recognize. The kingdom endures, but its soul." The Avatar tilted its head with predatory interest, and Ebo felt his words die in his throat as he realized that he was speaking to something that had no concept of souls or spirits beyond their tactical utility in warfare. Among all the clan chiefs and courtiers who served the transformed ruler, only Nana Akodo seemed capable of approaching the Avatar without visible fear. The ancient priestess had tended the kingdom's spiritual needs for 6 decades, and her understanding of the supernatural forces that shaped their world ran deeper than anyone else's. She came to the royal chambers one evening as the Avatar stood on the balcony overlooking the city, its inhuman senses scanning for threats that might emerge from the darkness beyond. "Do you ever dream of what you were?" the priestess asked, her voice gentle but carrying an undertone of profound sadness. The Avatar turned its blazing gaze upon her, and for a moment something that might have been curiosity flickered in those supernatural eyes. "Dreams are for mortals," it replied, its voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I am beyond such weaknesses now." Nana Akodo nodded slowly, as if she had expected such an answer. "The girl I knew used to have nightmares about failing her people, about making the wrong choices and causing suffering through her mistakes. In the end, her greatest fear came true. Not that she would fail to save the kingdom, but that saving it would require her to become something her younger self would have fled from in terror." The Avatar considered this observation with the same analytical interest it might show toward a particularly complex tactical problem, but no trace of the emotional response the priestess had hoped to evoke appeared in its transformed features. 6 months after the great victory, the Avatar announced its intention to expand the kingdom's borders northward, claiming the abandoned territories that the fleeing Sokoto forces had left behind. The decision was presented as a logical extension of defensive strategy. By controlling the traditional invasion routes, future threats could be identified and eliminated before they reached Ashanti heartland. But those who remembered the old princess recognized this as the beginning of the endless expansion that the Crimson Spear's curse would demand. The Northern Campaign was a masterpiece of military efficiency, with the Avatar's supernatural tactical abilities allowing a relatively small force to secure vast territories with minimal losses. Villages that had been razed by the retreating Sokoto were rebuilt as fortified outposts, their grateful inhabitants becoming fanatically loyal to the being that had restored their homes and security. Trade routes were established not for profit but for intelligence gathering, allowing the Avatar to maintain perfect knowledge of political developments across the entire region. Each success fed the spear's hunger and strengthened the curse's hold, creating a cycle of conquest and transformation that would continue until either the Avatar was destroyed or it had consumed everything within its reach. The clan chiefs watched these developments with growing alarm, understanding that they had saved their kingdom by unleashing something that would eventually destroy everything they had sought to preserve. Far to the north, in the great fortress city of Sokoto, Sultan Muhammadu received increasingly disturbing reports about the supernatural entity that ruled the southern kingdom. His spies described impossible feats of tactical brilliance, military campaigns that succeeded despite overwhelming odds, and a ruler whose very presence seemed to drain the will to resist from potential opponents. The Sultan had built his empire through careful calculation and superior technology, but this enemy represented forces that lay beyond the reach of conventional military response. General Usman, still bearing the psychological scars of his defeat at Pra River, advised caution and patient observation rather than any immediate military response. The legends speak of such weapons consuming their wielders entirely, he reminded his sovereign. Perhaps time will solve our problem for us, as the curse runs its inevitable course. But the Sultan's intelligence network brought word of the Avatar's northern expansion, and he realized that waiting for the supernatural entity to destroy itself might result in the Sokoto Empire being devoured in the process. Secret envoys were dispatched to distant kingdoms, carrying proposals for alliance against a common threat that grew stronger with each passing season. The next phase of the conflict would not be a simple clash between armies, but a coalition of desperate nations united by their fear of what the Ashanti kingdom had become. A year after her transformation, the Avatar had achieved everything a mortal ruler could dream of: absolute security for her people, vast expansion of territorial control, and military dominance over the entire region. The kingdom prospered under her supernatural guidance, with trade flourishing and the population growing as refugees from less stable regions sought the protection of the Crimson Spear's power. By any objective measure, her reign was the most successful in Ashanti history, surpassing even the legendary achievements of the kingdom's founder. Yet there was something profoundly wrong with this perfection, a hollowness at the heart of the Golden Kingdom's success that wise observers could sense even if they could not name it. The Avatar ruled with flawless efficiency but no joy, protected her people with supernatural devotion but no love, and expanded her domain with brilliant strategy but no vision beyond the next conquest. She had become exactly what the curse intended, a weapon in human form, designed to wage war and claim victory without regard for any other consideration. Chief Yaw, now one of the few remaining links to the old days, sometimes wondered if they had truly won their freedom or simply exchanged foreign conquest for domestic tyranny. The answer, he suspected, lay in the fact that no one dared ask such questions aloud anymore, not even in the privacy of their own thoughts when the Avatar's supernatural senses might detect such treasonous doubts. The alliance against the Ashanti kingdom took shape slowly, forged in secret meetings between desperate rulers who recognized that their individual kingdoms stood no chance against the supernatural power that had emerged from the southern lands. The Masi king contributed his legendary cavalry, the Dagomba offered their skilled archers, and even distant Benin sent representatives to discuss coordinated resistance against the common threat. Each kingdom brought its own strengths to the coalition, but all were united by the understanding that the Avatar's expansion would eventually reach their borders unless they acted decisively. Sultan Muhammadu coordinated the alliance from his fortress city, using his empire's vast resources to supply weapons and coordinate strategy among the diverse coalition forces. The irony was not lost on him. He had created this threat by invading the Ashanti kingdom in the first place, forcing their princess to take up the cursed weapon that had ultimately destroyed her humanity. Now he found himself leading a desperate struggle to contain the monster he had inadvertently unleashed upon the world. Portuguese traders, sensing opportunity in the chaos, provided advanced weapons to all sides while carefully maintaining their neutrality. The stage was set for a conflict that would dwarf the Battle of Pra River, a clash between the supernatural power of the Crimson Spear and the combined might of a dozen kingdoms fighting for their very survival. The coalition's preparations could not be hidden from the Avatar's supernatural senses for long. Her network of spies and informants, now enhanced by otherworldly intuition, brought word of the gathering armies and secret negotiations that surrounded the Ashanti kingdom like a slowly tightening noose. Rather than responding with alarm or concern, the transformed ruler received these reports with the cold satisfaction of a predator that had finally found prey worthy of its attention. The Crimson Spear's hunger stirred restlessly, anticipating the feast of violence and victory that the coming war would provide. The war council that convened to address this threat bore no resemblance to the desperate gatherings of the old days, when mortal advisors had struggled with impossible choices and uncertain outcomes. Now the Avatar's supernatural tactical genius mapped out the coming conflict with perfect clarity, identifying each enemy's strengths and weaknesses, predicting their likely strategies, and formulating responses that would maximize the destruction of coalition forces while preserving Ashanti's strength. The clan chiefs who served on this council had learned to simply nod and implement whatever decisions the Avatar made, understanding that their role was to execute rather than advise. The woman who had once agonized over the cost of each battle was gone, replaced by something that viewed the approaching war as an opportunity for expansion, rather than a threat to be defeated. As summer turned to autumn, both sides prepared for what would undoubtedly be the largest military conflict the West African savanna had ever witnessed. The coalition armies gathered at predetermined points along the Ashanti border, their combined strength representing the martial power of more than a dozen kingdoms united in common cause. Veterans of countless smaller wars found themselves serving alongside traditional enemies, their ancient rivalries set aside in the face of a threat that transcended all previous political considerations. The Avatar's response was characteristically efficient and ruthless. Rather than waiting for the coalition to complete its preparations and coordinate its assault, she launched preemptive strikes against the most vulnerable enemy positions, using her supernatural speed and tactical brilliance to eliminate key commanders and disrupt supply lines before the main armies could effectively respond. Each victory fed the Crimson Spear's hunger and strengthened the curse that had consumed her humanity, creating a feedback loop of power and corruption that made her progressively more dangerous with each passing day. The coalition leaders, watching their carefully laid plans crumble under the Avatar's supernatural assault, began to understand that they faced not just a military opponent, but a force of nature that could not be defeated through conventional means. The Battle of the Three Rivers began at dawn on a day when the morning mist hung low over the water, turning the landscape into a dreamscape of half-glimpsed shapes and uncertain distances. The coalition had chosen this location carefully, using the multiple river crossings to limit the Avatar's mobility while maximizing their own advantages in numbers and positioning. General Usman commanded the center, drawing on his bitter experience from Pra River, while the Masi cavalry held the flanks and Dagomba archers provided covering fire from elevated positions. But the Avatar's supernatural awareness pierced the mist like sunlight through clouds, revealing every enemy position and planned movement with crystalline clarity. She appeared where least expected, struck with devastating efficiency, and vanished before coordinated retaliation could be organized. The Crimson Spear, now fully integrated with her transformed essence, carved through enemy ranks like a force of nature unleashed. Coalition commanders who had never faced supernatural opposition found their traditional tactics utterly inadequate against an opponent who moved with inhuman speed and fought with perfect tactical knowledge. By noon, the carefully planned battle had devolved into a desperate rout, with coalition forces fleeing across all three rivers while the Avatar stood among the corpses of their fallen, her blazing eyes scanning for the next target worthy of the spear's attention. In the aftermath of the Three Rivers battle, the Avatar's supernatural senses detected something that would have troubled her human predecessor, but merely interested her transformed consciousness. The coalition's retreat was too organized, too disciplined for a truly broken army. General Usman had learned from his previous encounter and was trading space for time, drawing the Ashanti forces deeper into hostile territory, where they could be surrounded and overwhelmed by sheer numbers. It was a sound strategy that might have succeeded against a mortal opponent, but the Avatar's inhuman nature made such conventional approaches ultimately futile. The pursuit that followed became a masterclass in supernatural warfare, with the Avatar's forces covering impossible distances and striking with precision that bordered on prophetic. Village after village fell to her advance, their populations either fleeing ahead of her army or being absorbed into her expanding domain. Each victory strengthened the curse while weakening whatever remained of her connection to human concerns. The clan chiefs who accompanied her forces watched with growing unease as their transformed queen became progressively more alien. Her decisions guided solely by tactical efficiency, rather than any consideration for the human cost of her campaigns. Chief Yaw, riding at the head of his clan warriors, began to wonder if they were witnessing the birth of something that would eventually consume not just their enemies, but their own people as well. The coalition's true strategy revealed itself when the Avatar's forces reached the ancient fortress of Gambaga, where the combined armies of 7 kingdoms had prepared their final stand. The location was chosen with desperate cunning, a natural bottleneck surrounded by hills that would force even a supernatural opponent to engage on terms favorable to the defenders. Portuguese cannons lined the ridges, their iron mouths pointed toward the narrow valley where the Ashanti forces would have to advance, while thousands of warriors waited in concealed positions to spring the trap. The Avatar surveyed the killing ground with inhuman calm, her supernatural senses reading the tactical situation like an open scroll. Any mortal commander would have hesitated before such formidable defenses, perhaps seeking an alternative route or waiting for reinforcements. But the Crimson Spear's influence had long since burned away such cautious instincts, replacing them with an overwhelming hunger for glorious battle, regardless of the odds. She smiled with predatory anticipation as she gave the order to advance, knowing that the coalition's careful preparations would only make their inevitable defeat more satisfying to witness. What the coalition leaders had not anticipated was the Avatar's willingness to sacrifice her own forces to achieve victory. As the Ashanti army advanced into the valley, the Portuguese cannons opened fire with thunderous fury, each blast sending warriors flying like broken dolls. But the Avatar herself moved through the carnage like a crimson meteor, her supernatural speed allowing her to traverse the battlefield faster than the artillery could track. The Crimson Spear had evolved beyond a mere weapon. It was now an extension of her very being, capable of deflecting cannonballs and carving through fortified positions with equal ease. The coalition's trap became their tomb as the Avatar reached the ridge line and began systematically destroying their artillery positions. Each cannon silenced was a victory that fed the spear's hunger. Each enemy slain strengthened the curse that had long since consumed her humanity. General Usman, watching his carefully laid plans crumble once again, made a decision born of desperation rather than tactical wisdom. He ordered a mass charge of all remaining forces, hoping that sheer numbers might overwhelm even supernatural opposition. The gambit failed catastrophically, as the Avatar's enhanced awareness allowed her to predict and counter every movement while her otherworldly strength carved paths of destruction through the densest enemy formations. By sunset, the greatest coalition army ever assembled in West Africa lay broken and scattered across the hills of Gambaga. Victory at Gambaga marked the end of organized resistance to the Avatar's expansion, but it also completed her transformation into something that existed purely to wage war and claim territory. Standing among the ruins of the ancient fortress, surrounded by the corpses of thousands who had died in futile opposition to her power, she felt the last vestiges of human emotion drain away like water from a cracked vessel. The Crimson Spear's hunger was temporarily sated, but its influence had become so complete that she could no longer distinguish between her own desires and the weapon's inexorable demands. Chief Yaw approached with the caution of a man approaching a dangerous predator, his weathered face showing the accumulated strain of months spent serving something that wore his beloved princess's face, but possessed none of her humanity. "The kingdoms of the north lie open before us," he reported, his voice carefully neutral. "Their armies are broken, their leaders fled or dead. We can expand our borders to the great desert if you command it." The Avatar turned those blazing crimson eyes upon him, and he felt his soul shrivel under that supernatural scrutiny. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from the depths of the earth itself. Expansion serves no purpose without enemies to conquer. We shall establish our dominion here and wait for new challenges to emerge. The pronouncement carried a terrible finality, for it meant that the Avatar would rule forever, an immortal tyrant sustained by the curse that had devoured everything human within her. In the months following Gambaga, the Avatar's domain expanded to encompass territories that stretched from the forest kingdoms of the south to the edges of the Great Sahara in the north. Her rule was absolute and efficient, administered by a bureaucracy that existed solely to maintain the military apparatus the curse demanded. Trade flourished under her protection, but only because prosperous subjects could support larger armies. Art and culture were encouraged, but only those forms that glorified warfare and conquest. The Golden Kingdom that had once prided itself on wisdom and justice had become something unrecognizable, a machine designed to produce and sustain endless conflict. The surviving clan chiefs found themselves transformed into mere functionaries, their traditional roles subsumed beneath the Avatar's supernatural administration. Chief Osai, now bearing the hollow title of War Minister, sometimes wondered if they had truly won their freedom or simply exchanged foreign conquest for something far worse. The Avatar's rule was more efficient than any mortal tyranny, but it was also more complete and inescapable. There could be no rebellion against a ruler who could predict every plot, no escape from a domain whose borders were patrolled by supernatural awareness, no hope that time would weaken an opponent sustained by forces beyond mortal understanding. They had saved their people by creating a monster that would rule them forever. Years passed, then decades, and still the Avatar remained unchanged while those around her aged and died. The curse that had consumed her humanity also granted a terrible form of immortality, not the peaceful eternal rest promised by the ancestors, but an endless existence devoted solely to the pursuit of war and conquest. She watched Chief Yaw's funeral with the same analytical interest she might show toward any other tactical development, feeling neither grief nor nostalgia for the man who had served her faithfully until his natural death claimed him. The new generation of clan leaders had never known the Avatar as anything but the supernatural ruler who had always commanded their kingdom. To them, her inhuman nature was simply another aspect of royal authority, no more remarkable than a king's crown or a queen's ceremonial regalia. They served efficiently and without question, having been raised from birth to accept that their sovereign existed on a plane beyond mortal understanding. But sometimes, in the deep archives of the royal library, scholars would find fragments of older records that spoke of a princess who had once wept for her people's suffering and agonized over the necessity of wielding cursed weapons. These documents were always quietly removed and destroyed, for they described a world that no longer existed and a ruler who had been consumed by the very power she had sought to protect her kingdom. As the Avatar's immortal reign entered its second century, the world around her kingdom changed in ways that would have fascinated her human predecessor. New technologies emerged from distant lands, different empires rose and fell beyond her borders, and the very nature of warfare evolved as gunpowder weapons became more sophisticated and widespread. But the Avatar adapted to each development with supernatural ease, her curse-enhanced awareness allowing her to anticipate and counter every innovation that might threaten her domain. The kingdom itself had become a monument to military efficiency, its every institution designed to serve the needs of endless preparedness for wars that never seemed to materialize. The Avatar's supernatural power had become so well known that potential enemies chose submission over confrontation, creating a peace that was really just fear crystallized into political policy. Trade delegations arrived bearing tribute rather than seeking partnerships, their representatives careful to show proper deference to the immortal ruler, whose reputation had grown into legend throughout the known world. But this peace brought no satisfaction to the Avatar, for the Crimson Spear's hunger could only be fed by genuine conflict, and a victory won through reputation alone provided no nourishment for the curse that sustained her existence. In the deep chambers beneath the palace of Kumasi, where the artifacts of the kingdom's history were preserved for posterity, Nana Akoto's successor maintained a vigil that had been passed down through 5 generations of high priestesses. The current keeper of the sacred mysteries was a young woman named Efua, whose grandmother had served the Avatar during the early years of her transformation. Among the most carefully guarded relics was a portrait of Princess Amma painted during her 16th year, showing a young woman whose eyes held warmth and compassion rather than the blazing crimson fire that marked the Avatar's gaze. Efua had studied this portrait countless times, trying to understand how someone who had possessed such obvious humanity could have been transformed into the supernatural entity that ruled their kingdom with efficient indifference. The old records spoke of desperate choices made during a time of crisis, of a young woman who had sacrificed everything to save her people from foreign conquest. But those same records also made clear that the price of that salvation had been the complete destruction of everything that made her human. Standing before the portrait in the flickering candlelight, Efua wondered if the Avatar ever remembered what she had been, or if the curse had burned away even the capacity for memory, along with every other human emotion. The answer, she suspected, lay in the fact that the portrait had never been moved or touched, despite the Avatar's supernatural awareness of everything that occurred within her domain. Perhaps, somewhere deep within the cursed shell that wore a dead woman's face, some fragment of Princess Amma still existed, still grieved for what she had become. After 2 centuries of unchallenged dominance, the Avatar's supernatural senses began to detect disturbances that had been absent since the Great Coalition's defeat at Gambaga. European colonial powers were expanding their influence along the coast, bringing with them not just superior weapons, but also a different approach to warfare that emphasized technology over individual prowess. Their ships bristled with cannons that could level fortresses from miles away, and their armies moved with the mechanical precision of well-oiled machines rather than the chaotic bravery of traditional African warfare. The Avatar's response to these developments was characteristically thorough and ruthless. Coastal trading posts were established not for commerce but for intelligence gathering, while selected warriors were sent to serve aboard European ships to learn their tactics and technology. The Crimson Spear's influence had evolved over the centuries, granting her not just supernatural combat abilities, but also an inhuman capacity for strategic thinking that encompassed decades or even centuries of planning. She could see the colonial threat developing long before it reached her borders, and she began preparing countermeasures with the patience of an immortal predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The curse whispered promises of glorious battles to come, of new enemies whose defeat would feed its hunger and strengthen her power even further. The British expedition that eventually reached the borders of the Avatar's domain came not as conquerors, but as negotiators, their leaders having studied the historical records of previous attempts to challenge the supernatural ruler of the southern kingdoms. Captain Robert Morrison, a veteran of colonial campaigns across 3 continents, led a diplomatic mission that combined European technology with careful respect for local customs and beliefs. His instructions from London were explicit: establish trade relationships and gather intelligence, but avoid any actions that might provoke the legendary weapon wielder, whose power had become the subject of fearful whispers in colonial offices from Cape Town to Cairo. The Avatar received the European delegation in the Great Hall of Kumasi, her immortal form showing no signs of the centuries that had passed since her transformation. Captain Morrison, despite his extensive experience with exotic cultures and supernatural beliefs, found himself struggling to maintain his composure in the presence of something that radiated power like heat from a forge. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything in his experience. The Avatar's supernatural awareness allowed her to anticipate every negotiating position before it was stated, while her inhuman patience made it clear that she viewed these discussions as a minor amusement rather than a serious diplomatic engagement. By the end of the first day, Morrison understood that he was not dealing with a mere mortal ruler, but with something that existed on a completely different plane of existence. As the diplomatic meetings continued over several weeks, the Avatar found herself experiencing something she had not felt for decades, a faint stirring of what might have been curiosity about the world beyond her domain. The Europeans brought reports of technological marvels, political developments, and cultural changes that had reshaped civilization during her long reign. Steam engines, telegraph systems, modern medicine, democratic governments, innovations that would have fascinated her human predecessor, but now served only as tactical intelligence to be cataloged and analyzed for potential military applications. Captain Morrison, growing bolder as the meetings progressed without violence, made the mistake of asking about her personal history and the legends surrounding her transformation. The Avatar's response was swift and chilling, her blazing gaze fixed upon him with such intensity that he felt his soul beginning to freeze in his chest. "The woman whose history you seek is dead," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the golden ornaments throughout the hall ring like funeral bells. "She died willingly so that her people might live free from foreign dominance. I am what remains, a weapon forged in necessity and tempered by the blood of countless enemies. Do not confuse me with the mortal who once bore this form." The warning was delivered without anger or malice, making it all the more terrifying. Morrison realized that he was speaking to something that had no connection to human emotion beyond the clinical understanding necessary for tactical manipulation. On the final night of the diplomatic mission, the Avatar stood alone on the palace balcony overlooking the city that had been her domain for over 2 centuries. The lights of Kumasi spread out below like fallen stars, each representing lives that had been born, flourished, and died under her immortal rule, while she remained unchanged and unchanging. The Crimson Spear's curse had granted her everything a ruler could desire: absolute power, perfect knowledge of warfare, and the strength to protect her people from any conceivable threat. But it had also taken everything that made such gifts meaningful, leaving her as hollow and purposeless as a sword without a hand to wield it. The European delegation would depart in the morning, carrying back reports that would either discourage future colonial expansion or lead to the development of new strategies for dealing with supernatural opposition. Either outcome would eventually result in conflict, for that was the only way the curse could be sustained and the only purpose her existence served. She had saved her kingdom by becoming something that could never truly rule it, protected her people by transforming into a threat they could never escape. Princess Amma's sacrifice had been complete and absolute. She had given up not just her life, but her very humanity to ensure that the Golden Throne would never fall to foreign conquest. The price had been paid in full, and the debt would continue collecting interest until the end of time itself. As dawn broke over the kingdom of Ashanti, the Avatar returned to her chambers to begin another day of the immortal reign that the Crimson Spear's curse demanded. The European delegation would depart, other threats would emerge and be defeated, and the cycle of preparation and conflict would continue as it had for centuries past and would for centuries to come. She had become exactly what the ancient weapon required, a perfect instrument of war housed in a form that could never rest, never age, and never die until some power greater than the curse itself finally ended her existence. In the deep archives beneath the palace, the portrait of Princess Amma continued its silent vigil, the only remaining evidence that the Avatar had once been human. The young woman in the painting smiled with warmth and hope, her eyes bright with the dreams and aspirations that the curse had long since consumed. She had wanted to save her people, to preserve their freedom and ensure their prosperity for generations to come. In that goal, she had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. The kingdom endured, its borders secure, its people safe from foreign domination. But the cost of that success was a ruler who would never know peace, never experience joy, and never be able to set down the burden she had willingly taken up in humanity's darkest hour. The Crimson Spear had claimed its ultimate victory, not over any earthly enemy but over the soul of the woman who had dared to wield it. Princess Amma was dead, and in her place stood something that would rule forever in the shadows of what she had been, a living monument to the terrible price that power demands from those brave enough, or foolish enough, to pay it. Princess Amma saved her kingdom by sacrificing her soul. She became everything her people needed and everything they learned to fear. That's the power of a truly great story. It shows us that even victory has a price. If this epic tale of African fantasy captured your imagination, you're going to love what's coming next. I have dozens more stories of ancient kingdoms, cursed weapons, and heroes who faced impossible choices. Subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss an epic adventure. Comment below, would you have made Amma's choice? Next week, the shadow dancers of Mali, warriors who could walk between worlds but never return home. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Subscribe now and let's explore these legendary worlds together.